Great Swamp Massacre, Narragansett vs. Puritan, 1675. The sound of 1,000 boots crushing frozen snow echoes through the Rhode Island wilderness. Each footstep carries death. Closer to the Narragansett fortress, flintlock muskets gleam dully in the winter light as colonial soldiers advance through the bitter afternoon of December 19, 1675. Behind them, 150 Mohican and Pequot warriors move silently, tracking the path their former enemies now used to hunt their own people. Welcome to Native Legends and History Stories. Join us as we uncover the untold stories of America's past. South Kingston, Rhode Island stands silent under a steel gray sky. The temperature has plummeted well below freezing, turning the treacherous swamp into a solid bridge of ice. Through this frozen landscape, a colonial army advances toward their target, an entrenched stronghold rising from the marsh. Cedar palisades 15 feet high form a protective wall around the settlement. Inside, thousands of men, women and children have sought shelter from both the winter and the growing conflict that has engulfed New England. At the heart of this fortress stands Sachem Condensate. His warriors have spent months reinforcing the walls with clay packed between logs, creating firing positions along the perimeter. Food stores line the interior of the fortress. Dried corn, smoked meat, and preserved fish meant to sustain his people through the bitter months ahead. What the English see as a threat, the Narragansett view as their last refuge. The roots of this confrontation stretch back 6 months, to the summer solstice on June 20, 1675. Metacom, known to the English as King Philip, launched the first strike in what would become a desperate bid for survival. As Sachem of the Wampanoag, Metacom had watched his father Massasoit's careful diplomacy crumble under the weight of colonial expansion. For generations, the Wampanoag and settlers had maintained an uneasy peace. Massasoit welcomed the English in 1620, seeing potential allies against rival tribes. Trade flourished. English cloth and metal tools exchanged for native furs and corn. The settlers and natives shared hunting grounds and fishing spots. Wampanoag guides taught colonists to plant corn using fish as fertilizer, while colonial livestock roamed former native fields. But this balance shifted as more ships arrived from England. By 1662, when Metacom succeeded his father as sachem, colonial settlements had sprawled across former Wampanoag territories. Fences divided ancient hunting grounds. Colonial cattle trampled native cornfields. The settlers' numbers swelled while diseases ravaged native populations. In 1671, colonial authorities imposed a treaty that stripped native tribes of their primary means of defense and sustenance, their firearms. The weapons weren't just tools of war, but essential for hunting and protecting crops from predators. Without them, native families faced starvation. The treaty demanded tribes surrender these weapons to English authorities, effectively placing them at the mercy of colonial power. Tensions finally erupted in spring 1675. Plymouth Colony hanged 3 Wampanoag men for the death of a tribal member, a matter that traditionally fell under native jurisdiction. This execution demonstrated how far colonial authority had encroached on native sovereignty. For Metacom, it served as the final proof that peaceful coexistence had become impossible on that fateful June morning. Wampanoag warriors struck the settlement of Swans. They moved through morning mist with practiced silence, weapons ready when they emerged from the forest's edge. The attack came swift and coordinated. Houses erupted in flames, colonists fled or fell. By sunset, smoke rose from burning homesteads as survivors huddled in fortified buildings. This raid marked only the beginning. Violence spread across New England like wildfire. Wampanoag warriors struck isolated farmhouses and small settlements. Colonial militias retaliated by burning native villages and corn stores. Each side committed atrocities that fueled an escalating cycle of revenge. The New England colonies responded by drafting more men into service. Farmers and craftsmen became soldiers overnight. Colonial leaders forged alliances with rival tribes, the Mohican, Mohawk, and Pequot, who saw an opportunity to settle old scores. With the Wampanoag, the conflict scope expanded as more tribes chose sides or attempted to remain neutral. The Narragansett tribe under Sachem Conanchet initially tried to stay out of the growing war. In October 1675, they signed a neutrality treaty with Massachusetts. Bay Colony. The agreement promised peace, but colonial leaders remained suspicious. The Narragansett controlled strategic territory between warring parties. Rumors spread that they sheltered Wampanoag refugees fleeing colonial forces. By December, colonial patience had run out. The frozen swamp offered an opportunity to strike before spring thaws made the terrain impassable. On December 18th, colonial forces gathered at Richard Smith's trading post. The Massachusetts contingent brought 500 men, including 70 mounted cavalry. Plymouth contributed 150 soldiers. Connecticut provided 300 English troops and 150 native allies. Many of these men were veterans of previous battles. In King Philip's War, some had fought in the English Civil War. They came armed with flintlock muskets, pistols, and swords. Heavy winter clothing protected them from the cold, but would hamper movement in close combat. Each man carried ammunition, food, and basic medical supplies. Narragansett scouts tracked the army's approach, reporting its size and direction to Sachem Conanchet. The fortress's defenders prepared for battle, distributing arrows and loading muskets acquired through decades of trade. Warriors took positions along the walls, while women and children moved deeper into the settlement's interior. Throughout the autumn months of 1675, Pequot Sachem made regular journeys to Narragansett territory. They traveled in small groups of 3 or 4, arriving at dawn with offerings of wampum and trade goods. Their true mission lay in diplomatic pressure, attempting to draw the powerful Narragansett tribe into the expanding conflict. Each meeting with Narragansett leaders lasted hours. Conducted in the traditional manner around council fires, the Pequot emissaries spoke of ancient alliances, shared hunting grounds, and the growing threat of colonial expansion. The Narragansett maintained their stance of neutrality through these negotiations. Inside their fortified villages, however, another story unfolded. Wampanoag refugees arrived in small groups, women carrying children, elderly supported by younger family members, warriors bearing wounds from recent battles. The Narragansett provided shelter, food, and medical care, honoring traditional obligations to fellow tribes. Despite the political risk, colonial settlements surrounded Narragansett territory. On 3 sides, English farmers watched with growing unease as native travelers moved through the borderlands between communities. Reports reached colonial authorities describing armed warriors traveling at night, increased hunting parties near English settlements, and suspicious gatherings in remote locations. The reality of 3,000 potentially hostile natives living within striking distance of colonial towns sparked fear throughout Rhode Island. In early November, Governor Josiah Winslow took decisive action. He assembled a combined force from Plymouth, Massachusetts, and Connecticut militia. The column numbered 150 men, armed with muskets and carrying 10 days' provisions. They moved methodically through Narragansett territory, burning any village they encountered. Native dwellings collapsed in flames. Food stores critical for winter survival were destroyed or confiscated. The message was clear: neutrality would not protect the Narragansett from colonial retribution. The militia's advance drove many Narragansett east toward the coast. Families abandoned their homes with only what they could carry, seeking refuge in the tribe's primary stronghold deep within the Great Swamp. Inside this fortress, Stonewall John, the Narragansett master builder, had spent months overseeing construction. His nickname stemmed not from stubborn diplomacy, but from his extraordinary skill with stone and timber. Under his direction, workers raised 15-foot palisades reinforced with clay. Between the logs, a complex of wigwams housed hundreds of families. Storage buildings protected food supplies for the winter ahead. Colonial authorities demanded the Narragansett surrender all Wampanoag refugees. Representatives from both sides met 5 times over 2 weeks. Each meeting grew more heated than the last. The Narragansett leaders, bound by sacred traditions of hospitality and tribal loyalty, refused to hand over those who had sought their protection. Stonewall John, participating in his last diplomatic effort, ended negotiations with a clear statement. The Narragansett would not become instruments of colonial justice against their own people. On December 5, 10th and arrogance, at war party struck the Jerry Boole blockhouse. The stone fortification previously thought impregnable fell to a coordinated assault. Warriors used fallen trees as cover, maintaining steady musket fire, while others worked their way closer to the walls. When they breached the defenses, the fighting turned brutal. All 15 colonial defenders died in the close-quarter combat. The Narragansett seized weapons, ammunition, and supplies before disappearing back into the winter forest. The weather turned bitter as December 18th dawned. At Petticoat Scut below Tower Hill, colonial forces assembled for their response. The Massachusetts contingent arrived first. 500 men, including 70 cavalry, mounted on locally bred horses, adapted to the harsh New England winter. Each rider carried a sword and 2 pistols, with additional ammunition in saddlebags. The infantry bore muskets, 50 rounds each, and 3 days' food rations. Plymouth Colony contributed 150 infantry. Many veterans of earlier battles against the Wampanoag. The Connecticut forces brought 300 colonial troops, plus 150 Pequot and Mohegan auxiliaries. These native allies proved invaluable as scouts and trackers. They read signs invisible to English eyes. Broken twigs displaced stones. Scattered ashes from campfires that revealed the location of Narragansett. At movements, the combined force moved through Richard Smith's trading post, using its harbor to stockpile supplies. The post, normally a site of peaceful commerce between colonists and natives, now served as a staging ground for war. Barrels of powder and lead shot were unloaded from small boats. Wagons carried dried beef, hardtack, and other provisions that could sustain men in winter conditions. These weren't untrained farmers playing at soldiers. Many had fought in previous engagements during King Philip's War, learning harsh lessons about native warfare. Others brought combat experience from the English Civil War, where they'd learned disciplined volley fire and cavalry tactics. They moved with the confidence of professional soldiers, maintaining formation even through difficult terrain. Narragansett scouts tracked the Army's every move. Runners carried reports to the swamp fortress, detailed accounts of troop numbers, weapons, and supplies. The scouts noted the presence of Pequot and Mohican trackers, recognizing the threat. These skilled warriors posed to the Narragansett security. Inside the fortress, preparations accelerated. Warriors stockpiled arrows near defensive positions. Women filled vessels with water to fight potential fires. Children and elderly were moved to the most protected areas of the settlement. The colonial army's objective remained unclear to the Narragansett leaders. Some scouts reported hearing talk of forcing a new treaty. Others suggested the English plan to disarm the tribe entirely. The uncertainty complicated defensive preparations. How does one prepare for negotiation in battle? Simultaneously, the answer came from hard experience. Trust actions over words. The size of the colonial force, its composition, and its timing all pointed to hostile intent. Rhode Island's colonial population watched these developments with growing anxiety. They had witnessed the brutality of King Philip's War, first-hand burned farms, ambushed travelers, mutilated bodies left as warnings. The Narragansett's considerable military strength, combined with their uncertain loyalty, represented a potential catastrophe. Yet few suspected that the next day's confrontation would surpass all previous violence in scope and savagery. Dawn crept over Wickford settlement, painting the snow-covered ground in shades of steel gray. Inside a wooden blockhouse, a captured Narragansett scout knelt before colonial officers, his breath forming clouds in the frigid air. Under threat of death, his whispered words revealed the secret his people had guarded, the location of their winter fortress, deep within the Great Swamp. The morning of December 19th arrived. Bitter and unforgiving wind howled through bare trees as colonial forces assembled, their boots crunching on ice-crusted snow. The captured scout led them forward, his shoulders slumped in defeat. Behind him, the colonial army stretched like a dark serpent through the winter landscape, muskets gleaming dully, leather creaking in the cold, hundreds of boots marking the virgin snow. They crossed Tower Hill as weak sunlight struggled to pierce heavy clouds. The Chepachet River lay frozen before them, its surface a treacherous mirror. Several men slipped on the ice, their muskets clattering against frozen ground. The cold bit deeper with each passing hour. Some soldiers, their limbs growing numb and useless, had to be carried back to camp by their comrades. Their groans of pain were swallowed by the howling wind. Yet what seemed a curse proved a blessing in disguise. The frozen swamp, typically an impassable morass of mud and tangled vegetation, had transformed into a solid path. Where men would normally sink to their waists in black water and suffocating mud, they now walked on nature's bridge of ice. This discovery sent a ripple of excitement through the ranks. Voices grew louder, movements more purposeful. As if the very ground had conspired to aid their advance, the relative silence shattered without warning. Musket fire cracked from the tree line, the sound sharp and brutal in the winter air. Narragansett scouts materialized from the forest, like ghosts firing and falling back. Drawing the colonels forward, powder smoke hung in the cold air, mixing with the soldiers' frozen breath. The woods echoed with shouts, musket fire, and the meaty thud of bullets finding their marks. Through gaps in the trees, the English caught their first glimpse of the Narragansett stronghold. Cedar palisades rose from the frozen swamp like the walls of a primitive castle. Clay packed between logs caught the wan sunlight, giving the walls a dull sheen. Before the fortress lay a defensive work of brushwood and felled trees, branches interlaced to create a natural barrier. Captain Mosley, leading the Massachusetts company at the columns, had urged his men forward. In pursuit of the retreating scouts, the warriors had led them straight to the fortress's entrance. And only too late did Mosley realize the trap. A storm of arrows darkened the sky. Musket fire erupted from hidden positions along the wall, the air filled with the screams of wounded men, the sharp crack of flintlocks, and the whistle of arrows. The Massachusetts men staggered under the onslaught. Bodies fell in the blood-stained snow. Those still standing fired wildly at the walls, their shots splintering wood but finding few targets. The Narragansett warriors, firing from protected positions, displayed deadly accuracy. Each shot found its mark with terrible precision. Mosley, a veteran of previous engagements, found himself the focus of intense fire. Later he would tell Governor Winslow how he counted 50 warriors taking aim at him throughout the battle. The Massachusetts company wavered, then broke, retreating into the swamp. Their boots slipped on ice, now slick with blood, leaving crimson trails in the pristine snow. Governor Winslow, watching the Massachusetts line crumble, bellowed orders through the chaos. The Connecticut troops surged forward, their feet pounding across the frozen ground. Their target, a narrow gap in the fortress wall. That appeared to be its weakest point. As they advanced, the defending warriors adjusted their fire. Bullets and arrows carved deadly patterns through the attacking ranks. A massive fallen oak lay before the fortress entrance, its bare branches reaching toward the attackers like skeletal fingers. Colonial troops swarmed over it like ants, boots finding purchase on frost-covered bark. The tree meant as a barrier, instead became a bridge into hell. Inside the palisades, the battle transformed into a maze of chaos. Smoke from muskets mixed with frozen breath between closely packed wigwams. The sounds changed, the sharp crack of firearms giving way to screams, and the meaty thud of close combat. Colonial officers shouted above the din, ordering soldiers to set the native dwellings ablaze. Flames licked up the sides of bark-covered homes, hungry tongues devouring the dry winter materials. Thick black smoke billowed into the cold air as fire spread from structure to structure. The heat drove families into the bitter cold, mothers clutching children, elders stumbling through the snow. They emerged from smoke only to face leveled muskets. The reports echoed across the fortress as bodies fell, steam rising from blood-stained snow. The tide turned when the distinctive pop and flash of Narragansett muskets grew sporadic, then ceased entirely. Their powder stores had run dry. The silence that followed felt heavier than the previous chaos. Warriors drew knives and war clubs, knowing what the lack of ammunition meant for their people as dusk approached. Shadows lengthened across ground, now churned with blood and snow. Colonial leaders argued beside bodies of fallen comrades. Some wanted to withdraw to camp outside until dawn. Others, remembering the bitter cold that had already claimed lives, pushed for a final solution. The decision came as darkness fell. Fire would finish what bullets had started. The fortress transformed into an inferno. Flames roared into the night sky, painting clouds orange and red. The heat became so intense, it melted the surrounding snow, creating a moat of steam and slush inside. The fire moved like a living thing, jumping from wigwam to wigwam. Storage buildings filled with winter food burst into flames, corn and dried meat feeding the conflagration. Screams pierced the roar of the flames as those trapped inside faced an impossible choice: burn or run into enemy gunfire. The fire's glow revealed fleeing figures, silhouetted against the flames. Most of the warriors had already retreated into the forest, knowing the battle was lost. Now women, children, and elderly tried to follow, many falling to colonial bullets. Before reaching the tree line, the English withdrawal began as the fortress collapsed in on itself, sending showers of sparks into the night sky. They moved quickly through deepening darkness, fearful of counterattack from warriors regrouping in the surrounding forest. Behind them they left their dead where they fell, bodies already stiffening in the increasing cold. The night grew bitter throughout the surrounding woods. Wounded Narragansett, both warriors and civilians, succumbed to cold and injuries. Their cries grew weaker as temperatures plummeted, until only the wind remained. Dawn revealed bodies frozen where they fell. Blood turned to dark crystals on white snow. When morning came, the Sachem returned to a scene of devastation. The fortress had become a charred skeleton, smoke still rising from its remains. The ground around it was littered with the dead, his people and their enemies alike. Women and children lay where they fell, their faces frozen in final expressions of terror. Colonial dead lay scattered among them, their bodies already covered by fresh fallen snow. He began the grim task of burying the dead, digging into frozen ground to return his people to the earth. The exact count of the dead would never be known. Estimates ranged from 100 to several hundred Narragansett women and children. The English carried their own dead back to Wickford, leaving those they couldn't transport to be buried by the same hands that buried their victims. The cost of victory weighed heavy on the colonial forces. 70 men lay dead, including many officers who had led the charge. Another 150 nursed wounds that would mark them for life. The Massachusetts Regiment, having spearheaded the assault, bore the heaviest losses. Through bitter winter wind and deepening snow, surviving soldiers evacuated their dead and wounded to Aquidneck Island in Narragansett Bay. On the island, Rhode Island, colonists converted homes into makeshift hospitals, rooms filled with the sounds of suffering, groans of the wounded, prayers of the dying, scraping of surgeons' saws. The smell of blood and burning herbs hung thick in closed winter rooms as healers worked to save those they could. Time has obscured the exact location of the Great Swamp Fortress today. A solitary obelisk stands amid the wilderness, a stark monument to lives lost on both sides. Visitors to the area describe an unusual stillness that settles over the landscape. Birds fall silent, wind dies away. Even centuries later, the land seems to hold its breath. For years after the battle, winter rains and spring thaws revealed grim reminders of the slaughter. Bones worked their way through soft earth, fragments of stories left untold. The swamp became a burial ground, holding secrets beneath its surface. Local residents learned to avoid certain paths where the ground felt different underfoot, where mist gathered oddly on clear mornings. When spring came in 1676, Narragansett emerged from the winter's ashes, leading 2,000 warriors drawn from multiple tribes. Their torches brought Providence to its knees. Flames claimed colonial homes, just as colonial flames had claimed native shelters. But that night of vengeance, and its consequences, belonged to another chapter in this blood-soaked history. The Great Swamp Fight marked more than a battle. It carved a wound into the landscape that never fully healed. In its aftermath, both sides carried scars that would shape generations. The fortress ruins gradually vanished beneath earth and vegetation, but the story remains, preserved in soil soaked with sacrifice. Thank you for joining us on Native Legends and History Stories. Subscribe to uncover more hidden chapters of America's past.